I added the code that we were just looking at into our app. It says view order summary text view equals findViewById, and then we pass in the resource ID for the order summary text view. But this causes an error in Android Studio on the next line. It says it cannot resolve the method setText. If I add another line of code here, I can show you the types of methods that are valid on this variable. So we just created the order summary text view variable here, and it's of type view, and so on the next line we should be able to call methods on it. But if you look at the autocomplete suggestions, these methods are actually view methods. There's no text view specific methods. For example, there's no setText method. That's why we get an error down here when we try to call setText. You also can't set text size or set text color or any of those. So where are all those methods? Well, the thing is that a text view is a more specific type of view. So if we want to call text view methods on this object, we need to make sure that this is a text view object. Okay, now the variable is a text view object. But then I get another error that says incompatible types because a text view is required on the right-hand side, but we're finding just a regular view. That's because the findViewById method returns a view. So how do we reconcile this? Well, since text view is a more specific type of view, or put another way, a text view is a subclass of view, we can actually use something called casting. Casting in Java means that we can take the view returned by this method and actually treat it as a text view. So now this right-hand side is actually a text view object. And then we can store it inside this order summary text view variable. I know that this must be really overwhelming because I just mentioned a ton of new concepts. Let me try to explain again. The findViewById method returns an object of type view. By writing this notation, parentheses, with the desired object data type in the middle of it, we're casting this view into a text view. So the whole expression here evaluates to a text view object. Then we can store that in the variable on the left-hand side, which is order summary text view, and it has a type text view. Now on subsequent lines, we can call text view methods on this object. Do you see now how all the text methods are showing up here? Set all caps, set text size, and more. So I can just erase this now because set text should work, and there's no more errors. So if we want to be able to call text view methods, we need to have a text view object. In order to have a text view object, we need to call findViewById and then cast this view object into a text view. The reason why casting works is because this view here in the view hierarchy is actually a text view. If we try to cast it into something like a radio button, that wouldn't work because the order summary text view is actually a text view. So we have to cast it into the appropriate type. Similarly, in the display quantity method, we're calling findViewById and we're passing in this resource ID for the quantity text view. This returns a view and we cast it into a text view, and then we can store that inside this variable called quantity text view. This variable has type text view, and so on subsequent lines we can call text view methods on it, like setText. Here's the updated main activity code using casting. We can cast these views into text views so that we can store them in variables that have type text view. So in this list of main activity variables, now quantity text view and order summary text view are type text view. We can call text view methods on these, and we're not just limited to treating them as views. And now we can call text view specific methods on these variables. For example, we can call setText on the order summary text view, and we can call setText on the quantity text view. As you can see, you have to be careful about what data types are being used where. So far, when we've called methods, we haven't worried about the return value because the setText method actually has no return value. Same with the ImageViewSetImageResource method, this has no return value. But other methods can have return values. For example, in the TextView class, we have a getTextSize method. This returns an integer, so we can store the result of this method in a variable called size of type int. Here's another method that has a return value. In the button class, you can call the getHeight method, and this returns an integer value, so you can store it inside a variable. If you tried to store this result inside a string, for example, you would get an error because this method returns an integer. In order to know what type of data needs to be passed into a method and what data type gets returned back from a method, you should check the documentation. For example, in the TextView class, if you call any of these methods, it returns a value of type int. The return value data type is in the left-hand column here. For other methods, you might get void as a return value, or booleans, which we haven't learned about yet, or floats or longs, and etc. This documentation page also shows what are the expected data types for the inputs to each method. For example, the setTextColor method requires an integer as input, and the return value is void, so there's no return value. So check the documentation to know what data types are expected. Otherwise, you'll get errors in Android Studio saying that the data types don't match. Now it's your turn to practice. Below are 4 different code examples. Some of the code may contain errors relating to data types not matching. If you find an error, describe how you're supposed to fix it by writing it in the boxes provided. Otherwise, you can just write no error if the code is perfectly fine. This is going to be a challenging quiz because we just covered a lot of concepts and this code is still pretty new to you. Take your time and check the documentation for these methods. Make sure that the inputs and the return values are correct, and that if we're declaring variables, that we have the correct data types here. Also, look up the documentation for these method calls to make sure that we're using the methods correctly.